Hi, in this part, we're going to talk about exceptions and error handling. Exceptions are something that just happens, like sometimes a cable gets disconnected, the hard drive is full or has a failure, or sometimes the file that we're relying on gets deleted. So stuff happens. When those things happen, a web page might not be found. And when those things happen, Java has been designed for error recovery, or to have the tools for recovering from an error, or at the very least, allowing the user to know that there was an error. Java has this class called a throwable that is the root class of the exceptions. And then from there, a throwable is the overall blanket for a catch-all. From there, we can divide it into two classes. We have exception and we have error. Exception is something that you can recover from within your own program. An error is totally unrelated to your code, and it is something that you cannot really control. Like, for example, a networking error, the internet cable gets disconnected. There's no amount of power that in your program you're going to be able to reconnect to the internet or something like that. So these basically are exactly the same. When we see the code, actually, if we look at the API, we can see that these are exact replicas pretty much. It will have the same methods from throwable. And when we go into error, it just essentially has some constructors, but that's it. And everything is else is inherited. And exception is just some constructors, and that's it. Everything else is inherited from throwable. The big difference is that by naming convention, exception is something that you can recover from within your program. So if you see something that actually says exception, is something that you could technically recover from, and something that it's an error, it's something that you cannot. That's just basically a naming convention. There are two types of exceptions. One, the ones that the program knows that they might happen, because in the code we are alerting the developer that something might happen. So for example, if I'm writing file reader code, and if we do file reader API Java, for example, if we go into the website, we can see that in, I think, read, we'll see that it says throws IO exception. When we see that throws keyword in the definition of a function, that means that you are alerting that something within that code can cause an exception and it needs to be handled. And the compiler does a pretty good job at reporting all those things, but there are certain things that are outside of the scope of what you would be able to capture with an exception. For example, let's go into our IntelliJ and open it up and look at some of the code. And I'm going to delete this intro class that we were doing for the previous video. I'm just going to delete the contents. And let's assume that I have an array of ints. So we do int x equals, and we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's 5 elements. And then what we did for int, let's put int y, sorry, y less than x dot length, y plus plus. And if we had this loop, this would be handled correctly. Like say, let's just print x at position y, and if we run this, variable y equals 0. Yeah, let's run it now. We would get a counter from 1 through 5. But what happens if we say, something like this? It would still run because we do have a counter of 5, but for whatever reason, if we decided that it would be 6, an array index out of bounds exception would happen. That means that we're trying to access something that it's outside of the size of that array. And even if we said z, and we did int z equals 6, for a reason where the compiler is not going to evaluate the current running state of each part, the compiler won't really catch this one and won't know that there's an exception, and therefore it's not required that you put a try catch, or in other words, that your code is not going to be exception free. Exceptions can still happen even in code that it's not flagged as you're going to throw that exception. So then the big question is, how do we then handle exceptions? Let's assume that we still have this error. The easiest way, there's two ways of handling an exception. One, by saying that code is going to throw an exception and you're warning in advance, and that essentially just kicks the bucket until somebody else handles the exception in a different way. By handling the exception, I also mean the second method, which is essentially using a try-catch method. Essentially, we move that block into the try-catch exception E, something like that, and then we can do e.print stack trace. Actually, it's just e.print stack trace. So if we were going to do this, the code looks exactly the same, but there's the output looks exactly the same, but there's one big difference. That if I comment these lines out, and then later I add a code after code continued running, if I run it with the try catch commented out, that line of code continued running will never print. In this particular case, by me using the try catch block, you're going to see that this line is printed here, even though that we're still printing that exception. So basically, we can even make the error silent by commenting the e.print stack trace, and the code continued running as if nothing had happened, or I can just alert the user that something happened. And actually, I can even go for any custom messages like an error happened. And basically, by doing that I am handling the exceptions. So you can see an error happened and then the code continued running. That is basically one of the methods of how to handle an exception. Let's assume that then we want to understand how we would do it with the method number 2. Let's do public static, let's do void, whatever. Let's see, array index out of bounds. So this is my function. It has a long name, array index out of bounds exception demo. And we know that this code is going to be the code that it's problematic. I can handle such exception by me calling this function and say throws arithmetic index out of bound error exception. And actually, let's even just simplify it. Let's just see, throw let's just find any exception for whatever reason. Let's just file not found exception. Throw new file not found exception. When I say throw, I use the keyword throw just to, force the system to throw something. This is basically the same as that, but what I wanted to this is the same as that, but rather than the code being like an unhandled exception that I'm trying to catch or anything, I'm just going to go for something much more simpler by throwing a new exception. And when we say throw new file not found exception, then it's saying that the code is not handled. So if I tell the function that it throws a file not found exception, then guess where it moves? It kicks the bucket to further handle it at, or to handle it at some other part of the code. So then here I could then do another throws file not found exception, and it would be considered totally handled. So in order for us to handle this exception, then we would alt enter, and we have our two options on how to handle an exception: to add the exception to the method signature, which adds it down here, or if we go and do it again, surround it with try catch. And when we do surround with try catch is essentially what I just wrote. And in both situations, the code it is considered handled. The tricky thing, though, is that if we go and do this, where we put it in the exception signature, this line will not be printed. This one will be essentially the same as not handling the exception. And that is because once this exception happened, it got notified to upstream who was handling it, or who was supposed to handle that error. And by upstream, I mean this. Let me just run it in debug mode. And you can see that intro line 12 is what called this other function. So upstream in this case would be that. So there's an exception here that because of this, it gets passed upstream. And then because this is the upstream of that, then it just considers it handled, but it isn't in reality. Just for this particular situation where in the main you're putting the throws. But because of that, I would encourage you that in these cases you use the try catch. Now, let's assume that we are performing 2 or 3 operations, and 2 or 3 operations can have different exceptions. An example would be that we do another method. Let's call exception demo 2, and we're gonna throw a new illegal access exception. And if we did this, we can say file not found exception happened, and because right now we're only calling this function, the file not found exception happened. But what happens if say that right after we did exception demo 2, and then that error would not be handled because there's nothing in our try catch that is catching that illegal access exception. So we can nest catch statements where we can have different messages for each one of the different exceptions. So illegal access exception. So basically what we have learned, you can throw a new exception by using the keyword throw. You can define that a method is throwing an exception by having the keyword throws, and you can handle it by either having the keyword throws in the method, or which essentially kicks it further down in the bucket until somebody has to do a try catch. And also then there's a try catch mechanism that continues to handle it.